Welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. What is the state of the American empire? Is it suffering from military overreach? And can it continue to afford such a massive global military presence? Can the U.S. and its allies really afford more wars of choice? And importantly, is empire damaging the very foundations of American society? To CrossTalk the U.S. Empire, I'm joined by Herbert London in New York. He is President Emeritus of the Hudson Institute. Also in New York, we have George Samueli. He is a journalist, foreign policy analyst, and author of the new book on humanitarian interventions, Bomb for Peace. And in Boston, we cross to John Walsh. He is a political activist and contributor to antiwar.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. John, if I go to you first in Boston, how would you assess the state of American empire? Because we have a Democrat in power. It doesn't look that much different when a Republican was in power. So what is the state of the American empire in your mind?
Well, it's nice to be on and to join this discussion. I think the very way you put it, American empire, is something that we don't often hear in the United States. For many people, the idea that we have a military empire, despite our 1,000 bases around the world, is a new idea, or one that they might not have considered at all. But I think,
well, you know, John, if I can ask you, why is that the case, do you think? I mean, with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bases around the world, a global presence of a military that is not even comparable to any other country in the world in the history of the world, and Americans don't know about it?
Well, I think in a certain way that they don't. That if you ask people how much we spend on our military and our military reach, if you ask people how many bases we have around the world, most don't know. Most are surprised. But I think that is changing, and I think it's changing across the board. As a matter of fact, although he won't win the Republican nomination for president, I think the appearance of Ron Paul and the libertarian sentiment, which is against these foreign interventions on principle, humanitarian or not, that's the appearance of a new thought recently on the American political spectrum, and it comes from what we traditionally consider the right. That's something new, and I think that gradually the idea that we have an empire, its incompatibility with our democratic form of government, and its cost is dawning on the American people.
John, you're getting way ahead of me because you're covering all the topics. I was going to say, John, you're covering all the topics I want to cover in this program. Herb, go ahead. Jump in.
Well, let me just
jump in. Okay, well, you have plenty of time. Go ahead, Herb.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, first, I think that it's very unusual to describe this as an American empire. I wouldn't describe it an American empire at all. We have no desire for territorial acquisition. That is certainly not the purpose of having bases across the world. If anything, the United States is engaged in trying to create equilibrium. And as far as Ron Paul being a unique voice, if all you have to do is turn the clock back to 1955, Robert Taft was talking about American isolationism at that time. And clearly that's the isolationist point of view that you hear from Ron Paul. It's quite unacceptable, it seems to me.
Well, Herb, you said equilibrium. What is the United States trying to balance out?
International equilibrium.
What is the United States trying to balance out if it's equilibrium?
Well, trying to balance.
Well, who is it?
Again, equilibrium against the radical forces that exist in Islam, against what was formerly the communist empire. I think what the United States is attempting to do is to create stability in many sections of the globe.
Okay. George, what do you think about all of what we've heard so far? Go ahead, George.
Yes, I thoroughly disagree that the United States is in the business of creating equilibrium. The lack of equilibrium that we have is precisely created by the United States. We see, for instance, today in Libya, where we once had a very ineffective form of government. Now, after the U.S. intervention last year, or the U.S. NATO intervention last year, we now have complete chaos. We have absolutely no government at all. We have a country that is run by militia, gangsters, Islamists. These have all been hoisted into power through the ill-thought-out intervention last year. And now we're seeing the same scenario being played out in Syria, where the United States and its allies are in effect, sponsoring and fueling an insurgency that is bound to lead to a civil war and a total collapse of society in Syria and the persecution of minorities. So it's very hard to say that somehow the United States is in the business of creating stability. No, the United States is a force for instability and for fueling radical forces around the world.
All right, gentlemen, let me jump in here. We're going to go to a short report on the status quo of the American empire. Herb, I'll go back to you after this report.
An empire feeling the strain. The world's only superpower, the United States of America, is experiencing severe economic, political and social pressures. And for a growing number of observers, the country will no longer be able to police the world as its own backyard. Military overreach, ill-fated attempts at nation building and forced democracy promotion under both Democrats and Republicans is seeing the empire exhaust itself.
Despite our repeated warnings, Gaddafi continued his reckless policy of intimidation, his relentless pursuit of terror. He counted on America to be passive. He counted wrong.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
The UN Security Council passed a strong resolution that demands an end to the violence against citizens. It authorizes the use of force.
Irrespective of which party holds the White House, the same geopolitical agenda has been in place. No single power or set of powers would be tolerated on the global stage to challenge the American empire. Such a policy has been costly and carries with it tremendous burdens for the global economy and the American taxpayer. In 2011 alone, over $700 billion was spent on the military, an increase of more than $40 billion from 2010. This has created political blowback at home.
Young people right now have no hope in our society, and I just want to see a fairer and more just society for the young people coming up and all of the Americans that right now are suffering through these hard economic times.
The dollar as well is going through bad times and is losing its attractiveness with international trade conducted in local currencies and US debt growing by leaps and bounds. The future of the American empire looks bleak, but the habit of hegemony, it would appear, is a hard one to quit. Дар'я Чернышова for CrossTalk, RT.
Okay, Herb, I want to go back to you because you're turning into the odd man out, and I want to give you as much fair time as possible. Go right ahead.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Look, I think it's rather astonishing that we're talking about Libya without any mention of Gaddafi. I mean, you mean to say that Gaddafi was a realistic democratic proponent of Jeffersonian principles? Or if you're looking at Assad, the killings in Syria are justified because, after all, there might be chaos or a civil war in Syria, even though there are killings that are going on promoted by the government of Assad.
Yeah, but, I mean, Herb,
I think it's
Herb,
kind of
a lot of
foolish
people would
to make
say,
those claims.
a lot of people would say, in all fairness, it's very selective. You know, these are dictators and countries the U.S. doesn't like, and, you know, it has a geopolitical interest. I mean, we can look at Bahrain, look at Saudi Arabia. These are not nice. You know, there's oppression in Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia is not a nice country, okay?
In Syria.
I mean,
can I jump in here?
Please go right ahead. Go ahead, jump in.
Here, obviously, the United States is selective.
Okay, John, go ahead, jump in.
I'd like to say something about, yes. First of all, on the Libyan case, there was something extremely wrong about our action in Libya. For the war on Iraq, at least George Bush took the time to lie to Congress about going in. Barack Obama completely flouted the Constitution. He never even asked for a vote of Congress. He went in and waged war. That is an impeachable offense. Secondly, some of the facts about Libya are left out. There are tyrants all over Africa, all over the world. But Libya was unique in Africa in one sense. The United Nations has a number, which it assigns to every country, called the Human Development Index. It includes gender equity. It includes level of literacy. It includes standard of living. It includes health care. Now, Gaddafi's Libya had the highest human development index in all of Africa. So which dictator did Obama and his buddies decide to overthrow? It was the Libyan dictator.
Well,
now there weren't civil liberties
John,
there,
I mean,
but
take a look. I mean, what's the case?
I submit that the reason. Wait a second. I submit that the reason that Gaddafi was overthrown had nothing to do with the way he governed. It had to do with the fact that he was not under the control of the empire, which is exactly why Russia and China and Iran are official enemies. Has nothing to do with human rights. It's an excuse.
Well, keep in mind
Bahrain,
that the United States was in there for 2 weeks.
The United States was in there for 2 weeks.
Let's go to Herb. Gentlemen, I want to have fair time on this program. Herb, go ahead. You want to react to what you just heard? Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the president also acted inappropriately. I happen to agree with you. I think that we went in there for a short period of time, passed the baton to NATO, and NATO ran out of ordnance, and the United States had to continue this battle. Look, it seems to me that that was inappropriate. But if you're talking about Syria, the United States is not directly involved in Syria. It's the Russians that are directly involved in Syria. The United States is not involved, in large part because we wouldn't even know who to back if the United States were to get involved.
All right, I want to go to George. I want to go to George before we go to the break. George, you want to react to this? Go ahead.
Well, yes, I think that clearly what we have now in Libya, for instance, is a government that is far, far worse than what was the case under Gaddafi. No one is saying Gaddafi was a Democrat, but only the other day, some attorneys who had come from the International Criminal Court were arrested by the new government and are just being held indefinitely. I mean, at least under Gaddafi, he had actually cooperated with the international courts when he handed over the Lockerbie bombers. So this is clearly a degeneration rather than progress.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in and we're going to go to a short break. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the American empire. Stay with RT. Okay, George, I'd like to go back to you in New York. I mean, earlier in the program, we heard that the United States has a vast empire because it needs to create equilibrium of security in the world. I would posit that the more the United States advances its empire in the world, the more it creates blowback. I mean, this is really what we get. I mean, again, these intrusions into Arab lands, I mean, we're making enemies that we didn't need to have, okay? And I personally can understand why the United States has such interest in Syria. What geopolitical interest does it have there? Maybe it's called Iran. I don't know. Go ahead.
Yes, I think that what the United States is trying to do is creating a bloc of subordinate states committed to the U.S. military agenda and committed to the kind of U.S.-style corporate capitalism whereby you have socialism for the few and capitalism for the many, massive wealth for the few and largely poverty for the many. And I think that's what it's really about. Syria, Libya, Iran, all were, and of course Iraq before that, were all in some ways thwarting U.S. ambitions in the Middle East. And so one after another, the U.S. has targeted each of these states. So this has absolutely nothing to do with human rights violations.
The United States is directly involved in Syria.
The U.S. allies such as Saudi Arabia and Bahrain are the worst human rights violators in the Middle East. This is really about a geopolitical agenda of subordinating the large swath of the Middle East to the U.S. Military economic agenda.
Okay, Herb, you want to jump in there? Empire. Let's have fair time, gentlemen. Herb, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, this quasi-Marxist analysis is really absurd. Where is the United States? Where is the evidence of the United States' involvement in Syria? I mean, obviously, the United States would love to see Assad fall, but we're not entirely happy about what the consequences of that might be. And that is a continuing conversation that is taking place in our State Department at the moment. The idea that the United States knows what it wants to achieve in Syria is ridiculous.
Well, Herb,
we want to see Assad fail,
in all
but we're not really sure what the consequences would be.
Here. In all fairness, the Secretary of State that says Assad must go. So the United States does have an interest in the fate of Syria, one way or another. Okay,
and well, what is the that is a big political statement.
And every time, Herb, please, every time the United States says somebody has to go, you know what? They do eventually. John in Boston, you want to jump in?
Yes, yes. I want to go back to, well, there are a couple things. First of all, I want to go back to something Herb said. He said that the idea of isolationism is nothing new in American politics. Well, that's true. I said recently it's new. It hasn't made its appearance here in about half a century, since the 50s. What's new this time is that this idea of non-interventionism, which the right likes, the war parties like to call isolationism, they can if they want, it's a perfectly fine word. This time, it's not a child of the left or the right as we know it. It's a child of both. And I want to point out, if I can give a plug here to this book, Come Home America. 2 years ago, 40 of us, activists, writers, met together in Washington and produced this book of essays. Now, what was interesting about this group, this is an anti-war, pro-civil liberties group, but it didn't just include the left. The editor of the American Conservative was there, as was the editor of The Nation. And Ralph Nader was the keynote speaker at the insistence of the right, the American Conservative and others. This is something new, and it is something which tells us that a certain segment of the intelligentsia with very different ideological roots is fed up with war and empire. And one more thing. If we were interested in human rights, the worst violation of human rights, in a way, is apartheid. And we right now not only don't bomb the state of Israel, which, as Jimmy Carter said, is an apartheid state, just like South Africa, except it's directed at Arabs, not blacks.
Doesn't mean it's true.
We would be bombing Israel. Instead, Israel has a disproportionate effect on our foreign policy to encourage the support of apartheid.
Okay, all right.
So that gives a lie right there.
Very good point, Herb. But I have to go to Herb now.
What
we just heard there, and a lot of people say it outside of the United States,
well,
and more and more people in the United
States. I'm really
States.
offended by the idea that
it's hypocrisy. That's what we just heard. It's hypocrisy. American empire is hypocrisy.
Well, you heard hypocrisy, but you also heard a complete misunderstanding of what is happening in the Middle East. Israel is not an apartheid state. Jimmy Carter can make that assertion. That doesn't make it true. And even if the United States were to engage in the kind of isolationism that you make reference to, John, it seems to me there would still be war in the world. The idea that the United States is responsible for war is an absurdity. There is war that are occurring all the time, and if the United States were to pull back all of its troops, they come back within our borders, there would still be wars everywhere. So that the notion that somehow the United States is responsible for instability, that this so-called empire that you make reference to is what the problem is ridiculous on its face.
Okay, George, I'd like to go to you. Since the breakup of Yugoslavia, almost every single conflict the West is engaged in has been a war of choice. True or false?
Yes, yes. That's absolutely right. Because as we looked at the case of Yugoslavia, which was really the first post-Cold War conflict, throughout those years, the United States was in the business of sabotaging every possible peace agreement that was on the table. There was Bosnia, there was one peace agreement after another that was on the point of being signed, from the Kutiliera plan to the Vance-Owen plan to the Owen-Stoltenberg plan to the EU action plan. Every time there was an agreement on the table, the United States went out of its way to sabotage it so that it could get its bombing in and it could get its vindication of NATO. The same thing happened in Kosovo. Again, there were any number of possible agreements that were on the table. The United States went out of its way to sabotage it. And then we said the same thing, the same scenario again and again. We saw this in Iraq, where we had the Hans Blix mission, which was everything was being continued. There was weapons inspection. There was clearly no evidence of weapons of mass destruction, but the Bush administration was determined on a war in Iraq. The same thing happened in Libya. We had the African Union mission, where we had the President Zuma of South Africa said, look, we've got a peace agreement on the table. The United States went out of its way to sabotage it. Now we have the same thing in Syria. We have the Annan group, the Kofi Annan plan, and again, the United States is determined to ensure that this Annan plan fails. So yes, the United States is a force for instability, and it is a force for war. It's unfortunate,
go ahead,
but that's
Herb
the way
in New York, go ahead. Go ahead, Herb.
The idea that the United States is trying to undermine the Annan plan. The Annan plan can't work on its face. I mean, that's very clear. But Hillary Clinton made it perfectly clear that she wants to do everything that she can to cooperate with Kofi Annan. So the idea that somehow we're sabotaging this is ridiculous.
Well,
the
I mean,
idea that we were
Herb,
sabotaging events in
Herb,
the
let me ask you, I mean,
also
if
absurd.
the U.S. State Department,
isn't any
come on,
evidence to support these claims. I mean, it's one thing to say these things. It's quite another to justify them.
I think that a lot of things, we disagree on this program. That's why we're doing it. Okay, but Herb, when Secretary Clinton says Assad must go, I mean, how does that help the peace process?
It helps the peace process only because there have been roughly 12,000 people that have been killed in the streets of Syria. And if you ask those people, would you like to see Assad go? The answer would be yes. And if you were to poll the Syrians fairly, that would be the response you'd get as well. So it's perfectly clear that if you have someone who's butchering his own people, yes, he must go. Okay. He must go largely because he is violating every human right.
The West should arm the
May I jump in on that question?
John in Boston, come on, John. Let's not talk over each other. John first. John first.
As it turns out, I just returned from a trip to Peru. I went there to see Machu Picchu. But what I found in Peru, much to my surprise, is that isn't covered in the Western press, is that in the last few months, in 2 different provinces, states of emergency have been ordered. And one was in effect while I was there in the province of Espinar. And in that case, the peasants, the campesinos, were protesting against pollution by the big mining companies. And the president, a friend of the United States, a liberal of sorts, a kind of Obama figure, had peasants shot down by the dozens. Now there's a person killing his own people, to use a phrase that was just used about Syria, but we don't hear about it. We hear about human rights violations very selectively in certain places that are the enemies, the official enemies of the United States. And I would also say that the American people are beginning to wise up to the cost of this military machine that I would call an empire. Our income tax, our personal income tax, draws in $1 trillion roughly in revenue. The national security state, DOD, CIA, the foreign aid, and all the rest come to over $1 trillion a year. All our personal income tax, all of it, is needed to cover the cost of empire. $1 trillion, the gross product of the whole world is $60 trillion. So the United States alone, forget about its allies, is spending $1 in $60 of the world's GDP on its military empire. That is a scandal, and it's been going on since the end of the Second World War.
Herb, let's be fair, gentlemen. Herb, go ahead. Go ahead, Herb.
Let me provide you with some facts that you appear to be unfamiliar with. We spend 4.5% on defense in the United States of GDP, 4.5% of $15.5 trillion. That's not an awful lot. If you're talking about the budget, it's roughly $3.5 trillion. We collect $2.5 trillion from taxpayers. Not $1 trillion, $2.5 trillion. The largest expense in the United States is on the third rail, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid account for 60% of the budget in the United States.
All right, gentlemen. George, I'd like to go to you. I'd like to go to George in New York. I mean, it's been mentioned here, and I wanted to get to it, and I want to get to it before the end of the program. Is empire good business?
No, I really don't think it's good business. I think that the United States has been ill-served by an empire. I think clearly the inequalities of wealth that we're seeing in the United States is tied to an empire. I mean, this is clearly part of a kind of the domestic and military agenda. And you see here that how when it comes to anything that's important domestically in the United States, such as healthcare reform, it's almost impossible to get any serious healthcare reform done. But when it comes to a military intervention, I mean, it's just done overnight. I mean, Obama just says we're going to do this. We're going to bomb Libya. There's no discussion, no kind of congressional oversight. We just go ahead and bomb. And it's the same goes with any kind of war at all. You know, last week we had stories in the New York Times about Obama ordering assassinations.
All right, gentlemen, much more to discuss. A fascinating discussion, but we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests today in New York and in Boston, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.